space programme and Copernicus. So can my great and right honourable friend make sure that our conversations about Horizon also include Copernicus? Otherwise, the EU is going to be building Earth observation satellites that can't see the Earth.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome my right honourable friend's interest in this area, and she's absolutely right that we have enormous opportunity in our space sector across a range of aspects. I welcome her interest. I know that my honourable friend, the Minister, would like to discuss further with her her interest from her constituency, and I can also assure the House that there will be further updates coming soon on the UK government's space strategy.
The Minister, Chiomwara.
Thank you. In Vilnius, the Prime Minister had the chance to conclude a deal allowing our scientists to participate in the world's biggest international science programme, driving innovation and sustainable growth. He did not take it again. And so the Horizon saga drags on month after month, year after year. Are we in or are we out? The Science Minister isn't in the negotiations. The Chief Scientist isn't in the negotiations. It's all about the Prime Minister. So does the Minister understand that while the Prime Minister is dithering, our science base is withering?
Mr. Speaker, today is quite possibly my last opportunity at a dispatch box. I first served from these government benches in May 2010, and the Honourable Lady first shadowed me 10 years ago, Mr. Speaker. I know she has a very fine mind and she's a dedicated public servant. However, on this, she is wrong. The Labour frontbench may not know from one day to the next what their policy is. But, Mr. Speaker, we have been consistent on this point, and we are working hard to get that correct deal for UK taxpayers and UK science.
We come to topical Theresa Villiers.
Topical question number 1, please, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since I last updated the House, my right honourable friend, the Minister for Data and Digital Infrastructure, has announced £318 million of funding to bring the fastest internet speeds to some of our most rural communities. The Government Office for Life Sciences has agreed a landmark deal with BioNTech that will see up to 10,000 cancer patients benefiting from potentially life-saving treatments. And today, Mr. Speaker, my department has launched a call for evidence on engineering biology.
What action is the government taking to deliver regulatory reform and business investment in the biosciences sector so this can play its part in boosting economic growth and delivering great job opportunities for people around the country?
Mr. Speaker, can I welcome my right honourable friend's expertise in this area, and can I also take the opportunity to thank the team that works with me here, including my honourable friend, who has been central in leading the way that we will reform our regulatory landscape on life sciences. And can I also point my right honourable friend to the announcements by the Chancellor at the budget and still to come that are about how we will continue to support our life sciences and bioscience sector, because it is essential in the UK economy.
To the Secretary of State, Lucy Poll.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State for her time covering this role, notwithstanding her answer to my colleague from Newcastle Central, who asked a very important question, I thought. But today's inflation figures confirm that prices continue to rise. Broadband customers are dealing with inflation-busting price hikes as a direct result of her government's choices. They lifted the cap on wholesale costs, which has caused retail prices to rise. So will the Secretary of State apologise to hard-pressed families and tackle the cost of living crisis for broadband customers?
Minister.
We recognise that households are having a very difficult time under the cost of living, which is why my right friend the Chancellor has met with regulators to press them to do more to help. But we have got agreement that social tariffs are now available to all those who are in receipt of universal credit and other benefits, and at the same time Ofcom have agreed with providers that anybody who wishes to switch to a cheaper tariff can do so without charge.
Sir Edward Lee.
There can be few more exciting and innovative projects for any constituency than a spaceport to launch satellites into space. We had a done deal to build one on the runway at RAF Scampton before the Home Office marched in and stymied the whole project. Will the Minister please lobby the Home Office to try and get the runway back a spaceport? Why would the Home Office want a runway? Or is there some darker purpose behind this?
Well, my right honourable friend has raised this before, and I will happily come and speak to him about it and support that space cluster. The UK is poised to lead Europe in the launch of low Earth orbit satellites over the coming decade, and we're building launch pads around the country for that very purpose.
Drew Hendry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Royal Society shows that visa cost analysis in 2021, researchers entering the UK via the Global Talent System had to pay 6 times that of similar international science schemes. Does the Minister acknowledge the cost of Brexit in failing to attract world-leading researchers and skilled workers?
Mr. Speaker, I think the honourable gentleman is just on his own particular mission there. What he's failing to see is the strength of the UK science and technology sector, and indeed he fails to see that it will be a better future for Scotland's businesses and scientists and citizens to continue to be part of that thriving sector. That is what we are doing in making sure that the United Kingdom is a science and technology superpower.
Michael Fabricant, Sir Michael.
Indeed, following on from that answer, we have world-class universities in the West Midlands. So can I ask my right honourable friend, what plans does he or she have in order to support regional innovation clusters there?
Friend makes an important point. We're investing heavily in regional innovation clusters all around this country. 3 one in Manchester, 1 in Glasgow, and 1 in the West Midlands, where the excellent Mayor Andy Street is driving a genuine innovation economy.
Liz Twist.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Almost 1 in 2 properties in my constituency of Blaydon do not have access to gigabit broadband, and that's less than 1 in 5 in rural areas. They don't even have superfast connections. The department must help properties get connected where profit incentives are low. So will the Minister provide an update on the gigabit voucher scheme and the total value of vouchers claimed this year?
Well done.
Can I say to the Honourable Lady that currently over 76% of premises have access to gigabit-capable broadband, and we're on track to meet our target of 85% coverage by 2025. However, she raises a good point about take-up of social tariffs under the scheme, and we do want to see that happen much more. But we are determined to press ahead with Project Gigabit to achieve our target of universal coverage by 2030.
We now come to questions to the Prime Minister. I call Sajid Javid.
Question number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, the ban on LGBT people serving in our military until the year 2000 was an appalling failure of the British state, decades behind the law of this land. As today's report makes clear, in that period, many endured the most horrific sexual abuse and violence, homophobic bullying and harassment, all while bravely serving this country. Today, on behalf of the British state, I apologise. And I hope all those affected will be able to feel proud parts of the veteran community that has done so much to keep our country safe. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Mr. Speaker, can I associate myself with the remarks the Prime Minister just made? Mr. Speaker, in the UK, every 90 minutes, someone sadly takes their own life. Indeed, in this country, for men under the age of 50 and for women under the age of 35, this is now the biggest killer. When I was the Secretary of State for Health, I met many brave families and campaigners, and I committed to them that the government would publish a comprehensive, cross-departmental suicide prevention strategy. That was over a year ago, and still no strategy. Now, I know that my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, cares as deeply about this issue as I do. We've discussed it many times, and can I ask him, please, if he would commit his government to publishing this strategy within days of Parliament's return from the summer recess?
Mr. Speaker, when someone takes their own life, the effect on their family and friends is devastating. And I know the loss of my right honourable friend's own brother was an enormous source of pain for him. I want to reassure him that we are actively addressing suicide rates through our national suicide prevention strategy, backed by funding, and also particularly rolling out 100 suicide prevention voluntary community and social enterprises. But I can tell him that we will publish the new updated national suicide prevention strategy later this year.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, Labour in government was proud to repeal the ban against LGBT+ people serving in our armed forces. And today we strongly welcome this apology from the Prime Minister as a recognition of their historic mistreatment. Mr. Speaker, my constituent Ken Wright was a proud RAF serviceman, forced to leave the job he loved simply because he was gay. I'm delighted he is here today to witness this apology. And whilst we cannot right the wrongs of the past, the government should now act on the recommendations of the Etherton Review to fix the lives broken by the ban. It's what LGBT+ veterans deserve. Mr. Speaker, I also know the whole House will want to send our very best wishes to the Lionesses as they start their World Cup campaign this Saturday. Let's hope they continue the brilliant success they had in the Euros. Mr. Speaker, when the Prime Minister took office 9 months ago, the NHS waiting list had 7.2 million people on it. What's the number today?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the reason that the NHS waiting lists are higher today than they were then, after actually being stable for the first few months as we put in place new initiatives, is very simple, and that's because the NHS has been disrupted by industrial action, Mr. Speaker. Now, we've put very clear plans in place to bring down waiting lists in urgent and emergency care, in primary care, in ambulances and outpatients and electives. Those plans were working and will continue to work, but we do need to end the industrial action. So I'd ask the honourable gentleman, if he does care about bringing the waiting list down, does he agree with me that consultants and junior doctors should accept the pay deal that the government offered?
Mr. Speaker,
The Prime Minister likes to get away early. The more that you stop me getting on with the questions, the more I'm going to keep him here. So it's up to you how long you want the Prime Minister. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure the whole House is pleased that he's graced us with his presence today. But we don't get any more answers when he's here than when he's not. He knows the answer. 7 million people currently on the waiting list. Prime Minister, that's the highest it's ever been. It means that since he stepped foot into Downing Street, 100,000 people have been waiting in daily agony for things like hip and knee replacements, while he boasts. Has he figured out why, after 9 months, dozens of gimmicks, umpteen broken promises, his government is failing more patients than ever before?
Mr. Speaker, again, I don't think we heard an answer to the question, right?
And also, I don't want you holding up proceedings, Prime Minister.
It's very simple. If the honourable gentleman actually looked at what was happening earlier this year, what we have seen actually is that our plans were beginning to work. Ambulance and waiting times down from an hour and a half over Christmas to around half an hour. Virtually eliminating the number of people waiting 1.5 years for treatment, making huge progress on GP access. Now, all those things, all those plans we put in place, all the funding, all the extra ambulances, the extra discharge, all starting to make a difference, all held up by one very simple fact: industrial action in the NHS. Now, again, I'll give him a second chance. If he really wants to get people the health care that they want, will he agree with me that those doctors should accept the recommendations of the independent pay review body.
It will be a bad time to get thrown out. It's 6 weeks, I think, long and hard. Can I just say to the Prime Minister, it's opposition questions, it's Prime Minister's questions. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I think with his time away, he's slightly forgotten how this works. And he talks about his plans. He talks about his plans, his NHS staffing plan. He doesn't need to lecture me.
Order. It might be the last one before recess, but I'd just say to somebody, if they really want to take and go early, it will be very tempting to ensure that we do it. But think long and hard before you do. Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. He talks about his plans. He doesn't need to lecture me on that. On the NHS staffing plan, he nicked it from Labour. Yes. It's the same old story. They mess up the NHS and look to Labour to fix it. Come the election, the country will be doing the same. The difference is that, unlike us, he hasn't said how he'd pay for his workforce plan. Now's his chance. Where's the money coming from?
Mr. Speaker, not only is the NHS long-term workforce plan fully funded, it was welcomed by not one, not two, but by 43 different NHS stakeholders, Mr. Speaker. But no, he talks about our plans and are they making a difference? Well, let's just look in urgent and emergency care. Our plans mean that we'll put 800 more ambulances on the road, 5,000 more beds, faster discharge, more community care. That's why the Royal College of Emergency Medicine described it as significant and that it will undoubtedly improve conditions. But that's why, Mr. Speaker, what have we seen? A&E waiting times in England, the best in 2 years, Mr. Speaker. While Mr. Speaker, and they won't like this, while the NHS has the worst waiting times in the country in Wales, Mr.
Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when he said the workforce plan was fully costed, I've never seen the Chancellor more bewildered. It's less than a year since his party crashed the economy with their unfunded spending commitments, and he hasn't learned a thing. So let me ask it another way. Is his uncosted spending coming from more tax rises, more cuts, or is it just the latest promise to fall from the Tories' magic money tree?
Mr. Speaker, as I and the Chancellor set out, the plan is fully funded. He'll see that at the autumn statement. But I am pleased he's now interested in fiscal responsibility, because that is very welcome, Mr. Speaker. Because there's an opportunity for us to make sure that this is true conviction. We've just had, Mr. Speaker, in the last week, we've had the recommendations of independent pay review bodies, including for the NHS. Now, I believe the right thing to do was to accept those independent recommendations, but that involves taking difficult and responsible decisions to deliver those pay rises without fueling borrowing, inflation, taxes and debt. But on this crucial issue, Mr. Speaker, while his MPs are back on the picket lines, yet again on this issue, he simply refuses to take a position. It's the same old story. He should stop taking inspiration from his friends outside and unglue himself from the fence.
Who wants to lead the exit? Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, in that burst of nonsense, what you didn't hear was a single word about how he's going to be paying for it. Labour's NHS workforce plan is fully funded by scrapping the non-dom status that he so adores. You know the one, that non-dom...
Order. I think one or two of you have asked to catch my eye. You're not going the right way. Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Labour's workforce plan is fully funded by scrapping the non-dom status that he so adores. You know the one, the non-dom tax thing, as he calls it, that allows some of the wealthiest people in the country to avoid paying tax here. Is that loophole so important to him that he'd rather have billions in unfunded promises than simply making billionaires pay what they owe?
Mr. Speaker, the same policy that has paid, I think, for 5 different things at this point. I think, Mr. Speaker, everybody knows that I'm a fan of doing maths to 18, but the honourable gentleman makes a very strong case for doing maths all the way to 61, quite frankly. When it comes, Mr. Speaker, but when it comes to the substance of the plan, because it's important we address this, right? I am aware, actually, and I will say this. He did set out some proposals to train more staff. The problem is, Mr. Speaker, that's all he did. Our plan is much more comprehensive and it's much more impactful, because not only will we train more staff, Mr. Speaker, well, no, this is important substance, because I acknowledge the party opposite did set out some plans to train more, but that's not enough. You also have to set out plans, as we did, to retain more NHS staff. And you also crucially have to set out plans to how you reform the NHS so that you can have a more productive NHS. And that is the difference between us, Mr. Speaker. He is only ever focused on the superficial headline. We're getting on and doing the actual reform.
Mr. Speaker, if he's so good at maths, he'd know I'm 60, not 61. I don't know whether the Prime Minister's found time to visit Hillingdon Hospital during the recent by-elections, where the wards have had to close, staff are working in appalling conditions, and patient safety is at risk. And that's simply a snapshot of the wider problem. This week, the National Audit Office set out in detail what everyone already knows. The government's hospital programme has, shall we say, some gaps in it. So can the Prime Minister confirm that, apart from the fact that there aren't 40 of them, and the fact that most of them aren't new, and that many of them aren't even hospitals, everything's going fine with the 40 new hospitals?
Mr. Speaker, not only are we going to deliver on our manifesto commitment to build 40 new hospitals across the country by 2030, we're not just stopping there, Mr. Speaker, because we're also delivering 100 hospital upgrades across the country and, crucially, over 100 new community diagnostic centres to speed up treatment for people, including, Mr. Speaker, in the Deputy Leader's constituency, the Shadow Work and Pension Secretary's constituency, the Energy Secretary, the Justice Secretary, the Attorney General's constituency. That's how committed we are, Mr. Speaker. But look, let me end on this, because he mentioned Hillingdon Hospital, he mentioned Uxbridge. I tell you what, I want to help the people of this country, Mr. Speaker. I want to make sure that not only can they get to work, but they get the care they need. Why on earth does he want to charge them £12.50 every time they visit their GP and hospital?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There was welcome news this morning of inflation falling by higher than expected. The businesses in my constituency are trying to plan their pricing for next January and are struggling because of the proposals to introduce the extended producer responsibility, and they don't yet have the information on how much it will cost or how it will work. So would the Prime Minister look at pausing and resetting that programme? So what we don't see in January is price rises in our supermarkets without the consequent reduction in packaging and increase in recycling that we all want to see.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for the question. This is something that has been raised with me by those in the industry. Now, we are committed to protecting the environment and delivering on our net zero targets, but DEFRA are continuing to engage closely with manufacturers, retailers and packaging companies on the precise design of the scheme, and I know that ministers will continue to keep this House and my honourable friend updated.
Leader of the SNP, Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, the two-child benefit cap, as introduced by the Conservative Party, has left 250,000 children living in poverty. So can I ask the Prime Minister, does he take comfort in knowing that the heinous legacy of that policy will no longer just be protected by Conservative members, but by Labour members too?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I welcome the Labour leader's newfound support for our policy, even though he previously committed to a different approach. But what I would say to the honourable gentleman, and indeed the Labour front bench, is that they don't have to worry too much, because given the Labour leader's track record, he's never actually kept a promise that he's made.
Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, voters in Scotland are used to child poverty under the Tories. They almost expect it. But what they don't expect is child poverty support from the Labour Party. And if we look very closely right now, there is a shiver running along the Labour front bench looking for a spine. Now, Mr. Speaker, does this not tell us something much bigger? That for children living in poverty in Scotland, Westminster offers them no real change. It offers them no real hope.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the best route out of poverty is through work, Mr. Speaker, and the best way to ensure that children do not grow up in poverty is to ensure that they do not grow up in a workless household. That's why we have focused on creating more jobs, with 200,000 more in Scotland since 2010, and hundreds of thousands fewer children across the United Kingdom growing up in a workless household. We will always continue to reduce child poverty. I don't want to see a single child grow up in poverty, and we will deliver that in every part of the UK, including in Scotland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would my right honourable friend agree with me that if members opposite are in favour of illegal economic migration, then they should have the courage to say so, rather than claiming that young men in their 20s and 30s arriving here from safe countries are actually asylum seekers?
My honourable friend is right that the party opposite don't have a plan to tackle illegal migration, and we saw that just in this last week, Mr. Speaker, that they voted, I think, over 70 different times against our Stop the Boats bill. And that bill will make it crystal clear that if you come here illegally, you will be detained and swiftly removed to a safe third country. That is the fair, compassionate and right way to deal with this problem, and that's what we believe in.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's exactly a year to the day since UK temperatures hit a deadly 40 degrees for the first time, with 3,000 excess deaths last summer. Yet the Prime Minister's own climate advisers and businesses have said that his climate progress is worryingly slow. Now, he likes to claim that the UK is decarbonising more quickly than the rest of the G7, but since the Paris Agreement, that is simply not true. He likes to claim that it's not a top concern for the public, while recent polling shows that that's not true either. Experts, businesses and the public all want bolder climate action, but it isn't even one of his top 5 priorities. Can he tell us why not?
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady just makes a completely bizarre point. Because we moved quicker and faster than everyone else, she thinks that somehow is something that we should now not be proud of. It's right that other countries are catching up. It's inevitable that they will have to decarbonise faster now to make up for the fact that over the past 2 decades they haven't followed our example. So I'm not going to take any lectures for her on this topic, because our track record is a good one, Mr. Speaker. We have decarbonised faster than everyone else, and right now we are making the right long-term decisions to make sure that we do transition to net zero, but do so in a way that brings people along with us and creates jobs in the process.
Bedfordshire businesses now have apprentices on the factory floor earning £48,000 a year on qualification, easily beating cost of living pressures. So what more can we do to get schools to promote apprenticeships to pupils and parents, as our colleges and institutes of technology are great poverty-busting institutions?
Well, my honourable friend makes an excellent point. One of the practical steps that we are taking is to put all apprenticeships onto the UCAS system this autumn, which will make sure that they have parity of esteem in the classroom, increase information for parents and teachers. But at the same time, Mr. Speaker, as I announced earlier this week, we are clamping down on university courses that fail to deliver good outcomes. Because what we should be doing is providing young people with the best opportunities for them to get on in life, and he's absolutely right that that should include apprentices.
Dame Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Why does the Prime Minister think that Sir Brian Langstaff, who chairs the public inquiry into infected blood, has reopened the hearings and has summoned before him the Prime Minister, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Leader of the House and the Paymaster General to answer questions next week?
Mr. Speaker, my thoughts remain with all those affected by this appalling tragedy. The infected blood scandal should never have happened, and that's why the public inquiry was set up by one of my predecessors. I've submitted written evidence to the inquiry and am due to give oral evidence shortly, so it would be inappropriate for me to comment further at this time.
Greg Clark.
Indeed, Mr. Speaker. 800,000 people work indirectly or directly in our car industry, which accounts for 10% of our country's exports. So I strongly welcome the £4 billion investment by Tata in a battery factory, with the jobs associated with it. So will my right honourable friend build on that success and pursue a clear plan to get more gigafactories, including in the West Midlands, so we can capitalise on our lead in battery innovation and technology?
Well, my right honourable friend is absolutely right to highlight the importance of today's announcement, one of the largest ever investments in the UK auto industry in this country's history. Billions of pounds, thousands of jobs, and it is a massive vote of confidence in the UK economy.
Dr. Philippa Whitford.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The NHS in England has just had its longest ever junior doctor strike, and consultants go on strike tomorrow for the first time in 50 years. Yet so far Scotland has had no NHS strikes. This isn't by chance, but because our Health Secretary and First Minister have kept working with the BMA to try and address the pay erosion faced by doctors since 2008. Workforce shortages are the biggest challenge facing healthcare, and the Prime Minister just mentioned the importance of staff retention. So does he really think refusing to even talk to health unions will stop doctors leaving the NHS?
Mr. Speaker, we did talk to health unions, but we also respected the independent pay review body process, Mr. Speaker, which is the right way to resolve these issues, and it means a typical junior doctor will see a 9% pay rise as a result of that deal, Mr. Speaker. Combined with, as you mentioned, retention, earlier this year, the government delivered the #1 ask of the BMA, which was to remove the cap on pensions tax that was specifically designed to retain senior doctors in the NHS. So the government has now done its bit, and I would urge the unions to please get back to the hospitals and treat your patients.
Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend share my unease that a bank that has the government as its largest shareholder should close the account of a senior opposition politician? Will he use the government's shareholding to ensure that there is an inquiry into these circumstances, because the subject data access request makes it clear, or certainly indicates, that it is the person concerned's political views that led to his cancellation? And does my right honourable friend agree with me that however much we may find them tiresome, members of the opposition deserve bank accounts?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it wouldn't be right if financial services were being denied to anyone exercising their right to lawful free speech. Our new Financial Services and Markets Act puts in place new measures to ensure that politically exposed persons are being treated in an appropriate and proportionate manner. And having consulted on the payment services regulations, we are in the process of cracking down on this practice by tightening the rules around account closures. But in the meantime, any individual can complain to the Financial Ombudsman Service, which has the power to direct a bank to reopen their account.
That's sure.
Thank you very much. I know how it feels to be homeless, squatting from one place to another with your entire belongings in one single black bin liner. Hard-working families, including Bradford West, are at risk of homelessness because of a Tory mortgage bombshell and failing to legislate to protect renters. So can I ask the Prime Minister, apart from totally losing a grip on the whole situation, what is he doing to stop 500,000 people from becoming homeless?
Oh, Mr. Speaker, actually rough sleeping levels are about a third lower in 2022 compared to the peak in 2017. And since our landmark Homelessness Reduction Act came into force, over 600,000 households have successfully had their homelessness prevented or relieved, and we are investing £2 billion over the next 3 years to continue to tackle homelessness and rough sleeping.
Mark Francois.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister mentioned our armed forces. Can I mention them again? We lost 457 personnel in Afghanistan killed, and several thousand who suffered life-changing injuries. So I and some of my colleagues on the Defence Committee were absolutely stunned to see a video posted by our own chairman lauding the Taliban's governance of Afghanistan, not mentioning they're still trying to identify and kill Afghan civilians who sided with NATO forces, and also not mentioning the fact they don't like girls to go to school. So can I make plain this was not in our name, and can I have the Prime Minister's assurance that this silly and naive act was not in his name either?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I join with my honourable friend in paying tribute to our brave serving personnel and veterans and thank them for their service, as indeed we've touched on earlier today. And we have repeatedly and will continue to repeatedly call out the human rights abuses that we see around the world, and he mentions rightly the prohibition on women being educated in Afghanistan, which is something we've spoken about in the past. But we will also continue to have dialogue with regimes. That doesn't mean that we consider those regimes to be legitimate or approve of their actions, but that is all part, as he will understand, of establishing normal diplomatic presence in countries when the situation allows. But I'll very happily look into the specific case that he brought up with me.
Mr. Speaker, it's not just the adoption of the disgusting and heinous two-child benefit cap, it's the endorsement of a hard Brexit, the tuition fees, the immigration. Doesn't he agree that there's no real difference now between the two UK main parties? And isn't it time that we perhaps rearrange the furniture in this House and have them all on one big bench and perhaps retitle them that this is what you get from the UK party?
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the question. And I will leave him and the Labour Party to debate the finer policies between them. But I would say on the substance, because it is important that actually the track record demonstrates that we are making a difference in reducing child poverty, Mr. Speaker. There are now 400,000 fewer children in poverty than there were in 2010 as a result of the actions of this government, noticeably moving their parents into work, because it has the single best benefit for those children. That is the right policy, and it's one that we will continue to deliver.
Let's shake hands.
Therapy is quackery packaged up by bigots seeking to promote their hate and profit from it. On the 19th of January, the Minister at the Dispatch Box promised to bring forward a ban against conversion therapy and ensure that pre-legislative scrutiny was completed before the end of this parliamentary term. How does my right honourable friend plan to continue with that? But can I also welcome very much his statement from the floor today and thank those LGBT veterans who are here with us. We are so grateful for your service, and we do this ban also in your name.
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for her question, and I agree with her that conversion therapy is an abhorrent practice, and we need to do everything we can to stamp it out wherever we see it. The Minister for Women and Equalities will continue to keep her and the House updated on our progress.
Barry Sherman.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. Does the Prime Minister remember 7 years ago when he was a passionate supporter of leaving the European Union, along with his then best friend Boris Johnson? Is he aware that Sir John Major now says in every speech he makes that that decision was catastrophic for the people of this country and standards of living, and also deeply damaging to our role, status and influence in the world?
Mr. Speaker, I would say gently to the honourable member that at the beginning of his question, you think he made the central point. It was 7 years ago, Mr. Speaker, and we need to move forward. I would just gently point out to him, he talked about what's happened since then, that since we left the single market, this economy has grown faster than Germany, France and Italy, Mr. Speaker. and he talks about our standing on the world stage. Well, he wasn't here for our statement on the NATO summit last week, but nobody can be in any doubt that the United Kingdom is highly respected on the world stage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now then, just last week, the Leader of the Opposition announced his new flagship policy, the two-child benefit cap. It goes down very popular on this side of the House, but not so popular on that side of the House. But, Prime Minister, could you please tell the House, when will the Leader of the Opposition jump off the bandwagon and be honest with the British public and tell them what he stands for?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is right. Now, it would be one thing, and I say I welcome the Leader of the Opposition now supporting the government's policy, but I don't think anyone actually believes that he believes in what he's saying. And I think that is the...
Just say, you don't need to worry, you've no responsibility for the opposition. Neil Coyle.
Mr. Speaker, every single member of this House is required by law to confirm the true source of a donation before it is accepted or declared. So can the Prime Minister tell us if he followed all the rules all the time before he took £38,500 of free air travel on the 28th of April? And if so, why does his story keep changing about who paid?
Mr. Speaker, all donations are declared in the normal way, and as the honourable gentleman knows, if there are administrative changes to that, those are quickly corrected.
David Davis.
The Prime Minister, back to the question raised quite rightly by my honourable friend, the member for North East Somerset. The opposition politician he was referring to, of course, was Nigel Farage, whose bank account was closed, not because he was a PEP, not because of commercial reasons, but because his views did not align with the values of Coutts Bank, a thinly veiled political discrimination, a vindictive, irresponsible and undemocratic action. But in addition, NatWest also disclosed confidential details about Farage's account to the BBC and lied about the commercial viability of his account, actions which ought to jeopardise its banking licence and should certainly worry NatWest's 19 million other customers. So he's told us what he's going to do for the future, but there are many other people in this circumstance. So can he require every bank with a British banking licence to inform the Treasury of all the accounts they've shut down for non-commercial reasons the last decade?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know that the honourable gentleman has spoken to the Chancellor about this particular issue, and I know he'll continue to have those conversations. In the short term, having consulted on the payment service regulations, we do intend to crack down on this practice by toughening the rules around account closures. But in the meantime, the Financial Ombudsman Service is available for people to make complaints to, but I look forward to continuing the dialogue with him, as indeed does the Chancellor.
Final question, Colin Lockhart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a father, the Prime Minister will know how precious children are. Adam Watson, aged 9, and Poppy Ogle, aged 10, from my constituency, sadly lost their battle with childhood cancer just last year. Their homes are forever broken. Both families want to see a change in financial support for the 1,600 children diagnosed with cancer across the UK each year. Would the Prime Minister commit to meet with these families, to listen to their stories and to review child DLA payments to commence immediately on diagnosis of childhood cancer, whether that be a terminal diagnosis or not? The 3-month wait for support is just too long. Surely this government can see fit to wrap its arms around these children and their families in their hour of need.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable lady for raising this issue. I can't imagine how difficult it is for families whose children are being treated for cancer and everything that will come along with that. I will happily look into the specific issue that she mentioned and get back to her in all haste, and she should know that she has my total support for helping and supporting families who are going through what will be an unbelievably difficult time.
That completes Prime Minister's questions. Right, we now come to the urgent question. I call Holly Lynch.
Mr. Speaker, to ask the Home Secretary to make a statement on the contest update.
Home Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the government published an update to our counter-terrorism strategy contest. A WMS was laid together with the command paper in Parliament. Mr. Speaker, contest has a clear mission to reduce the risk from terrorism to the United Kingdom, our citizens and our interests overseas, so that people can go about their lives freely and with confidence. The terrorism threat level, set independently by JTAC, has not changed, but the threat from terrorism is enduring and evolving. Despite a prevalence of lower sophistication attacks in the UK, the threat we see today and in the coming years is more diverse, dynamic and complex. A domestic terrorist threat which is less predictable, harder to detect and harder to investigate. A persistent and evolving threat from Islamist terrorist groups overseas. And an operating environment where accelerating advances in technology provide both opportunity and risk to our counter-terrorism efforts. It's within this context that we judge that the risk from terrorism is once again rising. By far, the biggest terrorist threat comes from Islamist terrorism. It accounts for 67% of attacks since 2018 and about 3/4 of MI5's caseload. The remainder of the UK terrorist threat is largely driven by extreme right-wing terrorism, which amounts to approximately 22% of attacks since 2018 and about 1/4 of the MI5 caseload. Our counter-terrorism response will be even more agile in the face of an evolving threat, more integrated so that we can bring the right interventions to bear at the right time to reduce risk, and more aligned with our international allies to ensure that we continue to deliver together against this common threat. Through this updated strategy, we will place greater focus on using all the levers of the state to identify and intervene against terrorists. We will build critical partnerships with the private sector and international allies to keep the public safe. And we will harness the opportunities presented by new technology. Mr. Speaker, there is no greater duty for this government than to keep the British people safe, and I will not rest in delivering that mission.
Holly Lynch.
The contest update has very much been a sobering reminder of the threats we face. Our agencies, to whom we are so grateful, have prevented 39 late-stage terror attacks in the last 6 years. The majority of them, as we have just heard, Islamist motivated, with extreme right-wing terrorism making up the remainder. However, we are concerned by certain omissions from the update and the disparity between the threats outlined and the responses proposed. On AI, the update recognises the challenge, saying terrorists are likely to exploit the technology. We have called for new offences criminalising the training of chatbots to radicalise individuals, but concrete measures are woefully lacking in the update, so how is the government going to tackle this? The update says that the threat from Daesh and IQ is on an upward trajectory. So can the Home Secretary now tell us how we're working urgently with international partners to mitigate that risk? The desperate situation in prisons is laid bare, with 4 of the 9 terrorist attacks in the UK since 2018 perpetrated by serving or recently released prisoners. We are told individuals may develop a terrorist mindset during their time in prison. So not only are we failing to de-radicalise people in prison, but people are being radicalised in prison, and failures to manage those prisoners upon release is putting the public at risk. So can the Home Secretary tell the House how many terrorist prisoners are due to be released in the next 12 months, and has every one of them been engaged in intensive de-radicalisation programmes, and have they been assessed for TPIMs? And finally, perhaps the most glaring omission is on state threats. This is despite the fact that the Director General of MI5 made clear in his annual threat update in November that Iran is the state actor which most frequently crosses into terrorism. In February, our agencies said that they had to disrupt 15 attempted kidnap and assassination attempts here in the UK. Remarkably, the report makes no reference to the resources, the approach or the powers necessary to respond to this form of terrorism. The Home Secretary knows that we have advocated for prescription powers on multiple occasions. So why does the government continue to reject these proposals, and why have they not finally prescribed the IRGC?
Home Secretary.
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her comments. I know that she recognises the gravity and the sensitivity of this subject, and she will share my view that we must face the threat of terrorism united as a one and unified country. Since March 2017, our agencies and law enforcement have disrupted 39 late-stage terrorist plots in the UK, as she refers to. These have included the targeting of public figures, such as members of Parliament, specific communities and events, such as Pride, and public locations, such as iconic sites in London. I want to put on record my profound thanks and admiration to all of the professionals who work day in, day out, under pressure, for all they do to keep the British people safe every day. Many of us will never know the lengths to which they go, applying their expertise, dedication, and public service attitude to put our safety above their own. I'm very proud of this government's track record when it comes to keeping the country safe. As Martin's Law makes its way through Parliament, I expect the opposition to be responsible and support us in our efforts to provide this extra layer of protection for venues. We've seen significant reforms in our National Security Act, now enacted. She mentioned terrorism in prisons. Well, we take a very tough approach to managing terrorist prisoners, limiting their interactions with each other and restricting their communications. And we've developed a new Counter-terrorism Assessment and Rehabilitation Centre for expert psychologists and specialist staff to research and implement specialist programmes to draw offenders away from terrorism. And indeed, the independent review of Prevent made extensive reference to recommendations related to those in custody. She also referenced the use of artificial intelligence and technology. Well, it's clear, Mr. Speaker, that foundation model AIs undoubtedly hold vast potential, and they are crucial to the UK's mission to become a science and tech superpower. But there are still many unknowns with this class of technology and many other forms of emerging technology which pose significant but not yet fully understood public safety and national security risks. I'm particularly concerned about the rapid development and public deployment of generative large language models like ChatGPT, and we are alert to the exponential pace of their development, the emergent capabilities which make the exact risks difficult to anticipate or control, and the relative ease with which safeguards can be overwritten. So those at the forefront of those technologies are explicit about their seriousness and of these risks if proper safeguards are not developed quickly. So we look forward to promoting and enabling an open and constructive dialogue and deepened collaboration with tech company leaders, industry experts and like-minded nations as we seek to ensure the gifts of this technology are delivered and societies protected. Indeed, the recent Five Eyes security meeting held in New Zealand, where I represented the UK, we discussed the emerging hostile use of technology and collaborative ways in which at the international level we may work to mitigate those risks. But, Mr. Speaker, to conclude, I'm very clear that we need to face the threats united as one country. I hope the opposition benches understand the heavy weight of that responsibility and that we work together constructively to keep the British people safe.
Phil.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. One of the most effective ways to disrupt, identify and reduce the terrorist threat is to bring together the disparate and disjointed data sources which exist linking OCG activity to terrorists. Could my right honourable friend detail how the contest strategy will help make that happen?
Well, there is a huge, as I mentioned in my statement yesterday, there's a huge interaction and blurring of lines, if you like, between terrorist organisations and groups, hostile state actors, and serious organised crime groups acting on a transnational basis to sophisticated and well-resourced networks and acquiring a heightened level of elusiveness. That is exactly why our contest strategy and refresh to it has been refreshed to realign our priorities, our resources, our technological capabilities and our coordination across agencies to properly respond in a swift and robust way to these emerging threats.
SNP spokesperson Stuart Sunak.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I start also by expressing my party's deep gratitude to all those working to protect us from despicable terrorist attacks. And of course our thoughts remain with all those who have suffered as a result of such evil crimes. And on that note, while welcoming the focus in the strategy on victims, can I raise recent reports of survivors of terrorism who have been deeply upset by poor treatment from the Criminal Injuries Compensation Scheme? And can I ask the Home Secretary what discussions she has had with colleagues about fixing those particular problems? The commitment in the strategy to engage across the tech sector is indeed welcome, but like the Shadow Minister, I was surprised by the very limited reference in the strategy to use of artificial intelligence for radicalisation and instruction. A Windsor Castle crossbow attacker, for example, is a perfect illustration of someone being radicalised in that way. So can she say, does she believe legislation is required in this area? What more concrete steps are being taken to address use of AI in that way? What extra funding is going to be in place to support this refreshed strategy, particularly given reports that later this year we'll see a significant number of convicted terrorists completing their sentences and therefore requiring the most careful of management? And finally, Mr. Speaker, the strategy also recognises the critical importance of the closest partnership working with devolved governments and agencies which have responsibility for delivery of various aspects of contest. Can we have her assurances that that close working will continue?
Well, I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his observations. And he talked about the support and compensation for victims of terrorism. And I know that more can be done, must be done, which is why the government is reviewing the support available to better address victims' needs. But we are determined and absolutely committed to ensuring that victims of terrorism get the full compensation to which they are entitled, in line with schemes administered by the Criminal Injuries and Compensation Authority. And those schemes do deliver for victims of terrorism. The truth is no amount of compensation can ever make up for the ordeal suffered by victims of terror. And that is why it is right that survivors get all the support they need in whatever form that may be required through the publicly funded Seeker, which paid out more than £158 million to victims of violent crime last year alone.
Teresa.
I welcome this update of the strategy, and it would be helpful if the Home Secretary could tell us whether it contains elements to get the big tech companies to do more to prevent terrorists from exploiting their platforms, as highlighted in the ISC report on extreme right-wing terrorism.
Home Secretary.
Well, the technological aspect of terrorism is very real, and there are more and more sophisticated tools that our enemies are using against us for hostile purposes. That is plain from an intelligence point of view. That's why Contests makes a deliberate point of addressing the technological features of this kind of work, and there is a huge amount of investment and operational capability which has been put towards mitigating and dealing with this threat, most notably in the form of CTOC, a new collaboration centre which I had the honour of visiting very recently.
Chair of the Select Committee, Dame Diana Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, a few weeks ago I met Travis Frayne, who's the founder member of Survivors Against Terror, who explained how his life had been changed forever with the Westminster Bridge terrorist attack and how he didn't get the support he needed in the aftermath. So this week we've heard a survey of 130 survivors from 11 major terrorist incidents found that more than 2/3 felt that the compensation scheme overseen by the Criminal Injuries and Compensation Authority was unfair and unreasonable. The Home Secretary talked about a review. This is unacceptable that these people are in this position at the moment. When will the review actually be published?
Home Secretary.
As I've mentioned, there are no words, there is no amount of money that can adequately reflect the pain and suffering experienced by victims of terrorism. And that's why it is absolutely right that we provide victims of terrorism with full compensation and the fullest support possible and available to ensure that they are enabled to move forward from these tragic events. As I said, we know that more must be done. That's why we're reviewing the support available. We need to better address victims' needs through the current schemes, and we need to ensure that they are properly meeting the needs of victims.
Crispin Blunt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are people in Ukraine who found their territory illegally occupied and annexed by Russia. Their children disappeared into Russian custody and their land settled by ethnic Russians. Under international law, we recognise the right of these victims of the criminal actions of the Russian state to resist. How can we ensure that we don't end up characterising these legal actions by the victims in this conflict and in other conflicts legally precisely analogous around the world as terrorism?
Home Secretary.
Well, I'm very proud of the UK's track record of supporting Ukraine and the Ukrainians, both in Ukraine and abroad, through this devastating illegal conflict that Russia and Putin have waged upon them. It is right that we provide the military support. It is right that we took an extensive, we rolled out an extensive set of sanctions against Russia, and it's right that we continue in our international and diplomatic support for the Ukrainian.
Cavan Jones.
Can I add the Home Secretary's comments into our security services and thank them for the work they do? The ISC report last year into right-wing terrorism found that 30% of those disruptive plots were from right-wing terrorism. Our report also found that it was mainly young people and also as an aim to either join the armed forces or the police. We made recommendations on tightening up vetting, for example, of police officers, and also on prescribing membership of right-wing organisations to be members of the armed forces. Could you just update the House what progress has been made on those two issues?
Home Secretary.
Well, he's absolutely right to make reference to the emerging threat posed by extreme right-wing terrorism. And both the Director General of MI5 has referenced this in his annual update as these ideologies which are emerging and increasing in activity. And the independent review of Prevent focused on work that can be better done. It is absolutely right that we take robust action, and that is why I'm already acting on the recommendations set out by Sir William Shawcross on upgrading and updating Prevent so that it better responds to the risk of extreme right-wing terrorism as well as the risk posed by Islamist terrorism.
Henry Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In updating the UK's counter-terror strategy, what work are the security services doing with UK Border Force to identify those entering the United Kingdom, particularly by irregular means?
Home Secretary.
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right, because the terrorists and those who have malign intent for our nation will exploit all sorts of vulnerabilities, including at the border. That is obvious, and that's why Contest deals specifically with this issue and the upgrade. We need to further strengthen the UK border as a critical line of defence against terrorism, taking advantage of new immigration tools, detection, targeting and biometric capabilities to identify and block threats from entering the UK illegally in the first place.
Alistair Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a policy area that throws up some of the most difficult cases ever to be found. So I welcome the Home Secretary's determination to build political consensus and to ensure that we work with our strategic allies. Some of the most difficult cases around counter-terrorism involve UK citizens, especially children, who were trafficked by ISIS and are currently in northeast Syria. That's an area where we risk becoming an outlier because all our allies have repatriated their citizens. It risks causing friction between ourselves and our allies, and indeed we have our own responsibility to the fact that these are UK citizens who were trafficked. Is there anything in this strategy that is going to help to tackle these very difficult cases?
Home Secretary.
Well, he's right to refer to this, very regrettable feature of modern-day counter-terrorism. As Contest makes reference in paragraph 26, in recent years there's been a small increase in the number of minors investigated and arrested by counter-terrorism police. The most adverse activity conducted by minors has occurred online. Over half of under-18s convicted of terrorism offences over the past 5 years were charged with non-violent offences, so things like the collection or dissemination of terrorist publications. But it's absolutely vital that we that we're cognizant of this emerging threat, that we have the right resources and services and professionalism in place to mitigate and intercept the threat at source and as soon as possible. But it's clear that wherever criminality has occurred, there will be a robust response from the appropriate agencies.
James Wilde.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Technology brings huge benefits, but it's also exploited by terrorists. So is my right honourable friend confident that this updated strategy will ensure that technology companies do far more to prevent their services being used by those who wish us harm and to cooperate with our security and law enforcement services, particularly given the approach that some have taken on encryption and child abuse imagery?
Secretary.
Well, he's spoken about an issue that is very close to my heart in terms of the online child sexual exploitation. That is something that is rising at an exponential and horrifying pace. About 32 million instances of online child sexual abuse were recorded by the Global Recording Centre last year alone. In this country, in the UK, we arrest 800 individuals a month involved in this heinous crime, and we safeguard about 1,200 children a month. It is horrifying. That's why we are taking steps to work constructively with the tech companies. But in terms of Contest, I refer him to the extensive sections on page 21 onwards and other parts which talk about the technological aspect, how it's emerging, and our actions and our response. Notably, our world-leading counter-terrorism operations centre, newly established to bring together the right data, technology and expertise to investigate and disrupt these types of threats.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome this statement, although much delayed, much awaited. One of the key things that's missing from this is the use of CHISs, the covert human intelligence sources. These are what known as people who used to be informants to the police. Increasing number of people caught under this network are people with mental health issues in terrorism. Would you provide a detailed account of how many CHISs are used and what is the results, and how many people suffering from mental health are reported by these people? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Secretary.
Well, I can't get into details of which relate to operational independence and decisions made by the agencies in live investigations. But what I would say is that I expect all agencies and law enforcement organisations to use the full breadth of powers which we have afforded them.
Scott Benton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The current situation whereby tens of thousands of young men are arriving in small boats on our shores, primarily young men from unstable parts of the world, is frankly an accident waiting to happen. Does the Home Secretary agree with me that the British people expect our borders to be robustly enforced, and this is just as important when it comes to defending our nation from terrorism as it is for anything else?
Home Secretary.
Well, a strong border is critical to counter terrorism, and the Contest 2023 strategy clearly sets that out. In fact, the Nationality and Borders Bill 2020 Act 2022, the government revised Schedule 7 of the Terrorism Act, expanding powers to prevent illegal entry, including via small boats. Now, our migration and border system provides a critical opportunity to identify and manage individuals and goods who pose a terrorist concern. That's why rigour and robustness in our borders is absolutely essential for national security.
Mr. Speaker, in the government's response to the ISC extreme right-wing terror report, and can I thank the Home Secretary for referring to the scale of that threat earlier in her remarks, the government said our counter-terrorism strategy contest remains threat agnostic, so that rather than targeting specific ideologies, our tools, powers and overall CT approach can adapt to changing threats, while also ensuring our approach is able to identify and assess what are inherently ideological threats. So can I simply ask her to confirm there's nothing she's said today and nothing which has been published which changes the underlying philosophical basis of the way the contest strategy operates?
Secretary.
Well, as the contest strategy refresh makes clear, there are a broad range of ideologies and narratives which draw people into supporting terrorism. And that can range, as I said, from Islamist terrorism. That is by far the largest proportion of MI5's caseload. But there is also an increasing threat from extreme right-wing terrorism that we must confront, we must eliminate, and we must do everything in our power to stop. Wherever it comes from, however people are radicalised into extremist and violent behaviour, is unacceptable, and we take a robust approach ultimately to keeping the British people safe.
Mr. Speaker, now in June this year the Borders Inspectorate said that not every arrival into the UK at Manston was having security checks done as part of their interview or having their property checked. Can she guarantee now that every arrival is being fully checked? And if not, Mr. Speaker, why not?
Secretary.
Well, having visited the reception centre at the Western Jetfoil and Manston, and having been working very closely on ensuring that the right facilities and resources and mechanisms are in place to ensure that those who arrive illegally are appropriately accommodated, we do ensure that those who arrive are checked. They go through biometric checks, they go through any other appropriate checks, and then they are put through our processing centre, generally at Manston, and then they are put on a track effectively to other onward accommodation if they have an asylum claim. That is a general scheme that we've been carrying out for some time.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, UK police and security services used to conduct over 600 million real-time security checks on a shared EU platform before we lost access after Brexit. At the time, government informed us that we would have access to a shared platform within 2 or 3 years. But now the Permanent Secretary has advised that we will not have access to a shared data set until 2027 or 2028. So can the Home Secretary confirm just how much of a damaging effect is it having with the loss of this vital intelligence and security mechanism on our ability to tackle terrorism and cross-border crime?
Home Secretary.
I mean, I know he's on his, Brexit bandwagon or whatever it is, but the reality is, from a security point of view, we have never had stronger collaboration with international partners than today, and we have continued to develop our global reach and insight through sustained working with allies, particularly the Five Eyes, where we share an enormous amount of common approach and strategic development, but also with European partners. I've met with many of my European counterparts, and we share this common goal of combating national security. And in many instances, amongst European allies, the UK is seen as a leader and as a country and a nation which is valued for its contribution to pan-European national security.
Alex Davis-Jones.
Mr. Speaker, as my friend the Shadow Minister quite rightly states, the government's update acknowledges that when it comes to AI, terrorists are likely to exploit the technology to create and amplify radicalising content, propaganda and instruction materials, and to plan and commit attacks. Yet there are no concrete plans in this update to address these growing risks, and beyond pointing to the government's own delayed yet again online safety bill, which has been watered down, other than the rhetoric we have heard today from the Secretary of State, what is the government actually doing? What concrete plans are in place to tackle this growing problem? Because we've seen little to no action this far.
She obviously hasn't read the document, because if she had, she would see our actions, our achievements, and what our plans are. So first of all, I'll savour the trouble of reading the document, is that we are realising the full potential of our newly established world-leading Counter-terrorism Operations Centre. I don't think she's visited. I recommend that she tries to visit, because it's an incredibly impressive, as I say, world-leading operational centre established very recently, which brings together the right teams, data and technology to more effectively identify and interrupt and disrupt terrorists. We're also ensuring that there is a broader range of expertise from non-law enforcement interventions to mitigate the evolving terrorist threat. We are maintaining our investment in the critical threat assessment capabilities through the world-class Joint Terrorism Analysis Centre, JTAC. I could go on, but in the interest of time, she probably will do better to read the document first.
Luke Pollard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The new contest counter-terrorism strategy mentions that incel threats could, and I quote, meet the threshold of terrorist intent and action. The person behind the shooting in Plymouth in 2021, where we lost 5 people, could have had their actions informed by incel culture and violent misogyny. Incel violence currently falls out of the scope, largely, of all the prevent strategy tactics. So does the Home Secretary agree with me that it's now time to develop a cross-government incel strategy so we can not only prevent people going down that path towards violent misogyny, but also help rescue those people who are doing so, providing a greater level of community safety for not only women, but our entire community, and never again see the violence that we saw in Plymouth repeated on our streets?
Secretary.
Well, the honourable gentleman is an incredibly powerful advocate for his constituents, and let me put on record my thoughts and prayers for the loved ones of all of those who were tragically lost or affected. Incel culture is not strictly within the contest apparatus, if you like, but it does need work. I readily accept that this is a violent trend, it is a radicalising influence, it is promoting a culture that is totally at odds with a free, safe and democratic society that we all love and want to cherish. I'm very happy to speak to him about what further steps we could do and take as a government.
Stephen Farray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In March of this year, the security threat level in Northern Ireland was increased from substantial to severe in the aftermath of the attempted murder of DCI John Caldwell. Since 2016, the additional security funding that this government provides to the police service of Northern Ireland has been flatlined in cash terms at £32 million each year. So can the Home Secretary undertake to review the level of that funding to ensure that the PSNI and also the Security Service have the tools to continue their good work in combating both dissident Republican and loyalist terrorism?
Home Secretary.
Well, Northern Ireland-related terrorism does remain a serious threat, particularly in Northern Ireland, and the contest strategy doesn't actually address the threat from Northern Ireland in Northern Ireland. That is managed by a separate strategic approach, namely led by the Northern Ireland Office. But at the Home Office, and our contest approach does cover the threat from Northern Ireland-related terrorism in mainland Great Britain. So it is important that we don't decouple those two threats. They are very interlinked, and there is we know that some dissident Republican groups continue to carry out terrorist attacks. as he's referred to. So we need to ensure that all the resources are available, and we want to ensure that we support partners in Northern Ireland so that they are readily equipped to mitigate and respond to this threat.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In June, the National Security Advisor to the Canadian Government, a key Five Eyes member, listed Russia, China, Iran as key state actors which pose a threat to Canadian life. They then added India to that list due to the rise of Hindu nationalist activity targeting specifically Canadian Sikhs. I wonder if that's anywhere in terms of the Home Secretary's thinking around extremism